The dog barked once sharp, guttural, then fell into a growl, so deep it seemed to shake the bones of the old abbey. Detective Jack Monroe tightened his grip on the leash. The late afternoon sun bled thin across the Appalachians, casting Hollow Abbey in a bruised kind of light. Above them, the cross atop the stone chapel sliced a black silhouette against the dimming sky. Rook, Jack's German Shepherd partner, strained toward the line of priests assembled on the moss-slick steps. The dog's hackles rose like a tide. "Easy, boy," Jack muttered under his breath, but his own chest felt tight. Rook never growled without reason. The man standing at the front of the group. Father Michael offered a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. His hands were folded neatly over the front of his brown robe, sleeves hanging heavy. A tiny dark spot, almost invisible, clung to the hem. "We're terribly sorry you had to come all this way, Detective," Father Michael said. His voice was warm, pastoral, the kind you wanted to trust. "I'm sure young Emily simply found her way home." Jack said nothing. He crouched beside Rook instead, whispering low into the dog's ear. Rook's nose twitched furiously. His body leaned forward like a loaded spring aimed straight at the priest. The monks behind Father Michael murmured prayers under their breath. Jack straightened. His badge caught the last shard of sunlight. "We're not leaving until we find her." He caught it, then the slightest flicker, a narrowing of Father Michael's eyes. "Not fear exactly." Something colder. A calculation. The walls of Hollow Abbey swallowed sound. Even the heavy oaken doors closed with barely a sigh as Jack followed Father Michael into the sanctuary. The place smelled of damp stone, and old wax shadows clung to the edges of stained glass windows depicting saints with broken eyes. The air was colder here, heavy with a silence that wasn't holy. It was hiding something. Father Michael walked slowly down the aisle, fingers grazing the polished pews. "Emily attended our summer retreat for students seeking spiritual clarity," he said. "Sometimes young souls feel overwhelmed. They flee back to the noise of the world." Rook padded beside Jack, his claws tapping soft warnings against the stone floor. "She's been missing 3 days." Jack said. His voice, compared to the hush of the chapel, sounded almost profane. "That's not fleeing. That's vanishing." Father Michael stopped at the altar. A single candle burned there, throwing erratic shadows across the crucifix. "We're all praying for her." He said Jack watched as the priest reached down to adjust the cloth draped over the altar. Rook tensed instantly, baring his teeth with a low snarl. The muscles in Jack's neck went rigid. Slowly, methodically, he circled to the side of the altar. His boots scraped faintly over the stones. There, hidden by the candlelight's flicker, a dark, dried smear along the bottom edge of the white cloth. Not much, maybe just a few inches wide. But Jack had seen enough crime scenes to know the stubborn, brown-black signature of blood when he saw it. He looked at Father Michael again. That same soft smile, that same waiting silence. Jack said nothing. He clipped the leash short, gave Rook a low command, and followed the scent trail deeper into the abbey. The room they showed him was tucked off the main hall. Simple in its starkness. A narrow bed neatly made a wooden trunk at its foot, and a prayer book resting on the windowsill. Emily's room. Her absence was louder than any scream. Rook darted in, first nose, sweeping low along the floor, then climbing up the thin mattress, sniffing the pillow, the corners. Nothing at first. Only the sterile, cleaned-over scent of lavender water and bleach, too clean. Jack crouched beside the trunk. It wasn't locked. Inside folded clothes, a journal. A single photograph of a girl with freckles, smiling awkwardly under a waterfall somewhere lush and green. Emily. She couldn't have been more than 19. Jack flipped through the journal. Pages of neat handwriting about prayer sessions, homesickness dreams she'd had. Then, near the back, a few lines scrawled more hastily. Something isn't right here. The walls whisper at night. I feel them watching. The hairs on Jack's arms stood straight. Before he could turn another page, Rook whined. The dog was pawing at the wardrobe in the corner. Jack approached, cautiously pressing his ear against the worn wood. No sound. He opened it. Inside hung 2 brown cassocks identical to Father Michael's. One looked slightly damp around the hem. Rook thrust his nose deep into the folds of the cloth, then barked a short, angry bark that snapped against the silence. Jack peeled back the cassock. Near the neckline, almost hidden in the seam, was another dark, irregular stain. He pulled a small field kit from his jacket. A few swabs, a few reagents. A dab of solution turned deep crimson almost instantly. Blood fresh enough to react. Jack stared at it. Pulse hammering. Emily hadn't run. She had bled. Evening Mass filled the chapel with a dozen monks chanting in Latin, their voices weaving a tapestry of devotion thick enough to smother doubt. Jack sat at the very back. Rook at his feet. His eyes weren't on the altar. They were on Father Michael. The priest's voice rose above the others, pure and melodic. He spoke of forgiveness, of salvation, of the lost lamb returning to the fold. Jack watched the way his fingers clutched the edge of the pulpit too tightly, how his gaze kept flicking just briefly to the shadows at the chapel's edges. Not guilt, fear, and not of God. The Mass ended in a ripple of murmured amens. The monks filed out solemnly, their robes whispering against the stones. Father Michael lingered, dousing the candle at the altar. For a moment, the only light came from the dying embers of the sun, slanting red through the stained glass. Rook shifted his muscles, tense. Father Michael turned, and their eyes locked across the empty pews. Jack saw it, then, beneath the polished mask, something fraying at the seams. A man who knew the wolves were already inside the gates. Outside, the wind rattled the dead leaves along the courtyard paths. Twilight bled into night. Jack leaned against the hood of his unmarked car, staring up at the looming silhouette of Hollow Abbey. Somewhere inside those walls, the truth was curling itself tighter into the dark. He reached down and scratched behind Rook's ears. The dog licked his hand once, quick and reassuring. "We're not leaving without her," Jack said quietly. Above the abbey, the first stars flickered into existence, distant and cold. Behind him, the bell in the chapel tower began to toll. Not the slow, solemn peal of evening prayers, but a harsh, hurried clanging. An alarm. Jack jerked upright, hand instinctively going to his sidearm. Inside Hollow Abbey, someone was running, and whatever they were running from, Jack had the sickening sense they weren't afraid of getting caught. They were afraid of what would be found. The smell of lavender hung too heavy in the room, sweet and artificial, like a failed attempt to mask something rotten. Rook paced along the wooden floorboards, nose-low muscles wired tight. Jack stood in the doorway of Emily Carter's room. Arms crossed his silhouette, stretching long in the dying amber light. Everything was too perfect. The bed was made with hospital corner precision. A single book sat square on the nightstand. Even the prayer beads hanging from the window latch were arranged like a photograph in a brochure. Jack scanned the walls. No scratch marks, no overturned furniture, no signs of struggle, but no signs of life either. He moved slowly, methodically. His boots made no sound against the old planks. Rook whined, once pawing at the wardrobe tucked against the far wall. Jack approached. His fingers brushed the latch. The hinges groaned faintly as he pulled it open. Inside, 2 cassocks hung side by side, coarse brown fabric, identical to what the monks wore. At first glance they were unremarkable, but Rook's reaction wasn't. The dog sat abruptly, eyes locked on the cassock to the right. A low growl rumbled from his chest. Jack leaned closer. The scent of damp wool and incense filled his nose. Near the hemline, barely visible against the dark fabric, was a small, irregular smear, rust-colored, almost black. Now, blood, not enough to alarm anyone giving it a casual glance. But Jack didn't deal in casual glances. He pulled out a latex glove from his pocket, slipped it on, and pressed the edge of his fingertip against the stain. Still faintly tacky, still faintly alive. He turned his head, listening. Only the creak of old wood settling. He moved with purpose now, pulling a forensic swab from his kit. A quick twist, a dab against the stain, then a drop of reagent from the small plastic vial. The fabric turned deep crimson in seconds. Positive human blood. Rook let out a sharp huff. Tail. Stiff eyes alert. Jack pocketed the swab carefully and stepped back into the hallway. The walls seemed closer now, the shadows thicker. Somewhere down the hall he heard the faint clatter of plates in the kitchen. The low drone of monks in prayer life went on inside Hollow Abbey. But something inside this place had already died. He found Father Michael standing under the portico that overlooked the cloister gardens, watering a row of wilted roses with a battered metal can. The priest looked up as Jack approached, face wreathed in benign surprise. "Detective Monroe," he said smoothly. "I hope you found something that eases your concerns." Jack stopped a few paces short. "I found blood." The watering can tilted, spilling a dark trickle into the soil. Father Michael's smile barely faltered. Blood. On one of the cassocks in Emily's wardrobe. The priest set the can down carefully, wiping his damp hands on the folds of his robe. "Ah," he said, drawing the sound out, weighing it. "Likely from the garden. The grounds are rugged, thorns, sharp rocks. It's not unusual to come back from tending the rose beds with a few scratches." Jack said nothing. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out the swab, holding it between two fingers like a blade. Father Michael's gaze flickered to it. Quick, calculated. "It's human blood," Jack said softly. The silence that followed was not peaceful. It was loaded brittle. The wind stirred the leaves overhead. Somewhere, a bird shrieked a high solitary sound before falling quiet again. Father Michael's smile cracked slightly at the edges. "Detective," he said, voice lower, now almost confidential. "This is a place of reflection. We host dozens of pilgrims every year. Cuts, scrapes, bloody noses. Accidents happen." Jack watched him the way a wolf watches a man pretending not to be afraid. He slipped the swab back into his pocket. "Maybe," he said, "maybe not." By nightfall, Hollow Abbey glowed like an island in the sea of mist rolling down from the mountains. Its stone towers and leaded windows looked ancient, haunted. Jack stood in the courtyard, radio crackling faintly at his belt. The local sheriff's department had arrived, 3 cruisers, 6 deputies. Their presence bristled against the sleepy rhythm of the abbey like a foreign object. Father Michael had reluctantly consented to a search. Technically, Jack didn't need his permission. A girl was missing. Blood had been found. The law tilted in Jack's favor. But he wanted it done without violence if possible. Rook sat at his side, tongue lolling, but his body was still taut with focus. The monks gathered in small clusters under the cloisters, their faces pale, their eyes darting like birds startled from a field. One of the younger ones, Brother Isaac, Jack remembered, crossed himself repeatedly, muttering prayers that barely carried on the cold air. Jack addressed the group voice, cutting clean through the murmur. "This is now a crime scene. No one leaves, no one enters. Every room will be searched." A ripple of unease spread through the cluster of monks. Father Michael stepped forward. "Detective Monroe," he said, hands raised in a placating gesture. "Surely there's no need to treat us like criminals. Jack looked at him steadily. "Someone here is one." He turned to the deputies. "Start with the south wing. Check every room, every storeroom, every passageway. If you find anything, blood clothing, a scrap of paper, you call me." The men nodded, peeling off into pairs. Jack's boots crunched on the gravel path as he headed back toward Emily's room. Rook trotting alongside him. The mist was thicker now, curling around the columns like pale fingers. Somewhere behind him, a bell rang sharp metallic. Not the rich, slow bell of evening prayers. An alarm. Jack's heart kicked hard against his ribs. Rook barked once short and urgent, then broke into a sprint toward the darkened east wing. Jack ran after him, gun drawn. The Abbey was waking up, and something inside it was trying to slip away. They found the side door swinging open on broken hinges, mist pouring in like a living thing. Jack scanned the courtyard beyond, empty, silent. But Rook wasn't pointing outward. He was sniffing along the cracked flagstone's nose pressed to the ground, tracking something invisible to human senses. Jack knelt, running his fingers lightly across the stones. A smear. Almost invisible. Brown-red against the gray blood, leading inward, not out. A trap door yawned open near the base of the east tower. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades, rusted hinges, splintered wood, but the trail led straight to it. Jack clicked on his flashlight. The beam knifed into darkness, revealing a narrow staircase descending into the earth. Rook whined at the threshold, ears flat reluctant. Jack understood the feeling. Still, he went first. The steps groaned under his weight. The smell hit him halfway down, a dense, suffocating stench of mildew, rotting fabric, and something else. Something sweeter. Worse? The staircase ended in a small stone cellar lined with crumbling shelves. Old prayer books lay in sodden piles. Broken candles littered the corners. It should have been a storeroom. It felt like a tomb. Rook moved cautiously, nose working furiously. His path was erratic, uncertain, until he stopped at the far wall, pawing at the stones. Jack approached. There, almost hidden in the seams between the rocks, was a small scrap of cloth. Wedged tight, torn loose from something or someone dragged through here. Brown fabric. But beneath the mud and dust, Jack could make out a faint floral pattern, not part of any monk's robe. Emily's. He pocketed the scrap carefully, stomach knotting. Above them, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed faintly through the Abbey. Jack holstered his weapon and scratched Rook behind the ears. "Good boy," he murmured. They had a scent trail now, and Jack had a feeling it was about to lead them to something far uglier than a missing girl. Something still breathing, still hiding, still waiting. The rain came down in sheets so thick it erased the lines between earth and sky, turning Hollow Abbey into a smudged memory of stone and moss. Inside the main chapel, the monks knelt shoulder to shoulder, their prayers, threading through the damp air like a net trying to catch something already lost. Jack Monroe stood at the back, dripping rainwater onto the stone floor, watching their bowed heads. Rook paced beside him, restless. The monks chanted louder, the Latin syllables swelling and breaking like waves against the stained glass. But it wasn't devotion. Jack heard. It was fear. The dog moved first. Rook broke from Jack's side teeth bared in a silent snarl, stalking between the rows of monks until he stopped abruptly at Brother Thomas. The young priest flinched. A tiny thing, barely a twitch, but Jack caught it. Rook growled low in his throat, tail stiff muscles coiled. Brother Thomas kept his eyes squeezed shut, lips still moving in silent prayer. But his hands betrayed him, trembling so badly the beads of his rosary rattled against the stone. Jack stepped forward. His boots echoed in the heavy silence. The chanting faltered, collapsed into ragged whispers. Brother Thomas looked up, blinking rainwater and terror from his eyes. Jack said nothing. He simply extended a hand. Brother Thomas hesitated then. With a strangled sound, he dropped the rosary into Jack's palm like it burned him. The beads were sticky. Blood washed thin by the rain still clung to the tiny crucifix. Jack's voice was quiet enough that only Brother Thomas could hear it. "Where is she?" Brother Thomas's face crumpled like paper left out in a storm. The firewood was stacked in neat, proud piles along the eastern cloister, each log split and seasoned, ready for winter. Rook didn't care. The dog's nose buried itself in the bottom stack, pawing frantically, sending splinters flying. Jack dropped to his knees beside him, heart hammering. It didn't take long. Half buried under damp bark and broken branches was a shred of fabric, pale, almost gray from the dirt, but with tiny blue flowers still clinging to the weave. Jack recognized it. Emily's sundress, the one she wore in the photo he found in her trunk. He lifted the scrap gently, feeling the cold weight of it settle into his chest. Behind him, Brother Thomas sank to the flagstone's hands, twisted in his robe, rocking back and forth like a man already halfway gone. "I didn't hurt her," he whispered voice barely carrying over the rain, hammering the courtyard. "I swear to God I didn't lay a hand on her." Jack turned slowly, the fabric clutched in his hand. Then, "Why hide this?" Brother Thomas pressed both palms to his face, dragging down until his mouth twisted into a soundless scream. "You don't understand," he croaked. "They made me." Jack crouched down eye level. His voice was razor sharp now, no kindness left. "Who?" Brother Thomas shook his head, violently, tears cutting clean lines through the mud on his cheeks. "Father Michael. Brother Eli. They said it had to stay quiet, that she would ruin everything." The word everything hung there obscene. The Abbey. The lies built into its walls. The rotted foundation under the prayers. Jack's stomach twisted. "And now," Jack said. Brother Thomas looked up at him, wide-eyed, almost childlike. "Now it's too late." The rain blurred the edges of the world as Jack followed Brother Thomas through the northern edge of the grounds. Rook close behind. The young priest clutched a wrinkled, rain-soaked map to his chest, his fingers white with tension. They passed the crumbling garden walls, the broken sundial, the skeletal remains of an apple orchard long abandoned. Everything Hollow Abbey had ever been was rotting here, one silent collapse after another. At the edge of the forest, Brother Thomas stopped. He turned and thrust the map into Jack's hands, as if hoping the paper alone would absolve him. "There's an old path," he said, voice hoarse. "They used it before the retreat center expanded. It leads to a service cellar under the old chapel." Jack unfolded the map. Ink bled in thin, uncertain lines across the page, but the trail was still visible, a winding, hidden route through the woods skirting the cemetery and disappearing into the roots of the oldest part of the Abbey, a place no visitor would ever accidentally find. "She's down there," Brother Thomas whispered, "or what's left of her." Rook barked once sharp and urgent. The wind whipped at Jack's jacket, the scent of wet earth and old secrets curling through the trees. He glanced back. Once Brother Thomas had dropped to his knees again, clutching his head in both hands, rocking in the mud. Jack turned away without a word. He had a girl to find, and a hell to walk into. The forest swallowed him quickly, the towering pines closing in like ribs around a heart. Gone bad. Jack moved fast but silent, the map clenched in one hand, his other brushing the butt of his weapon. Rook darted ahead, nose pressed to the ground, tail low and stiff. The rain thinned to a cold mist, wrapping around the trees in ghostly veils. Every step sounded louder now, the crack of a twig, the squelch of boots in the mud. Time blurred. Then Rook stopped. Ahead, half buried in the undergrowth, was a door. Not a grand entrance. A simple slab of rotted wood set flush into the earth, barely visible unless you knew exactly where to look. Jack's pulse roared in his ears. He drew his flashlight, sweeping the beam over the door. Rusted iron hinges, a battered handle slick with moss. He crouched, pressed an ear to the wood. Nothing. Dead silence. He tested the handle. It moved. He glanced at Rook. The dog's ears were pinned flat, his body trembling with restrained energy. Jack drew his weapon, thumbed the safety off, and pulled. The door yawned open on a breath of fetid air, so dense it clawed at the back of his throat. Stairs led down into darkness. Jack hesitated for half a second, then went in. One step, another. The darkness swallowed him whole. The air tasted wrong the moment Jack stepped below ground, sour, metallic, alive with things that had no right to breathe. The flashlight cut a narrow tunnel through the darkness, throwing warped shadows across the stone. Dust drifted in the beam like ash from a slow, smothered fire. Behind him, Rook moved silently, every muscle taut. The staircase was steep, the stone slick under Jack's boots. Above them, the door yawned open to a world of rain and mist, and something that had pretended to be faith. Down here, the truth had nowhere left to hide. The last step crumbled slightly under Jack's weight, forcing him into a crouch. The ceiling of the cellar was low enough that he had to hunch. The smell was worse now. The sour stench of mold, old blood, and something darker, more human. Rook whined low in his throat, nose pressed to the floor. The beam of Jack's flashlight swept slowly across the chamber. It wasn't large, maybe the size of a one-car garage, but it felt endless in the way certain nightmares did. The walls were stone, old and rough. Thick wooden beams sagged overhead, black with moisture, cages. 3 of them rusted and small, shoved against the far wall. Dog cages, the kind used for animals, not people, but the scratches on the inside told a different story. Fingernails. Rook padded toward the cages, sniffing along the rusted bars. Hackles. Rising, Jack followed. Slowly, feeling the weight of the place settle into his chest like wet concrete. The first cage was empty. The second was worse. A filthy mattress soaked with old urine chained to the frame. Straps bolted into the corners. Jack's stomach twisted. The third cage held something small and rotted, too tangled in rags to make out clearly. He didn't need to look closer to know it wasn't alive. Not anymore. He turned the beam away. Something on the far wall caught his eye, a shimmer faint and desperate. He crossed the room. Rook close at his heels. There gouged into the stone with something sharp, and desperate were words. "Please help me." The letters were ragged, uneven, some carved so deep the stone had splintered, others scratched so lightly they looked like whispers. Jack raised a hand, tracing the grooves with his fingers. The stone was cold, colder than anything had a right to be. He imagined it, the girl, Emily, clawing at the wall in the dark, carving letters with broken nails or shards of metal, while whoever kept her here whispered prayers upstairs. He pulled back sharply, the image lodging in his chest like shrapnel. "Good boy," Jack muttered to Rook, who was sniffing frantically at a pile of rags in the corner. He knelt careful, brushing aside the damp cloth. A necklace, tarnished, simple. A tiny silver cross hanging from a snapped chain. Jack turned it over in his palm. The back was engraved faint but clear. E. Carter, Emily. He closed his fist around it. No body, no blood trail. Not yet. Hope clung like a dying thing in the wet, heavy air. The crawl space extended behind the cages, a jagged tunnel, no wider than Jack's shoulders carved crudely through the earth. Rook stood at its mouth, ears pinned, tail. Stiff, Jack swept the flashlight forward. The tunnel sloped downward. Not natural, not accidental. Someone had dug it with intent. He dropped to his hands and knees, heart hammering against his ribs, and slid into the hole. The earth closed around him instantly, damp and heavy and close. Every breath tasted of rot. Rook followed his body, pressed tight to Jack's hip. They crawled in silence, the beam bobbing ahead, throwing monstrous shadows against the curved dirt walls. It felt like being buried alive. 10 feet 15. The tunnel widened slightly, opening into a small hollow, barely tall enough to crouch. In the center of the space was a shallow pit. Jack edged closer, flashlight steady. Inside the pit, a tangle of fabric bones and hair. Small human, the edges of a dress still clung to the skeletal remains, blue and white, patterned with tiny flowers. Jack knew that dress. He'd seen it in the photo, seen it folded neatly inside Emily's trunk. His hands shook as he lifted the flashlight higher, tracing the perimeter of the hollow. More scratches on the walls. More words. This time not carved carefully, but gouged in frantic, slashing lines. "He prays while I bleed." The letters curved wildly, distorted by terror. Jack sat back hard against the wall, the cold seeping straight through his jacket. For a long moment there was no sound but the distant drip of water seeping through the earth. Emily had died down here alone. Afraid, buried under the prayers of men who had sworn to save her. Rook whined softly, nosing at Jack's knee. Jack reached out, raking a hand through the dog's thick fur, grounding himself. "We found her," he whispered. But the victory tasted like ash. Jack crawled out of the hollow, out of the tunnel, out of the cellar, back into the rain. The world above hadn't changed. The mist still clung to the trees. The Abbey's bells still tolled in the distance, heavy and indifferent. But Jack had changed. Something inside him had gone still, like a pond freezing over under the first hard frost. He stood in the rain, Emily's necklace clutched in his fist, feeling the cold work its way deeper under his skin. Around him, the Abbey loomed, silent, patient. Waiting, Rook leaned against his leg, trembling. Jack looked up at the jagged silhouette of the chapel tower stabbing into the bruised sky. Somewhere behind those stones, someone had decided a girl's life was less important than a secret, and that someone was still breathing, still praying, still lying. Jack turned, heading back toward the Abbey, the mud sucking at his boots. He wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The bones told a different story than the prayers. Under the harsh beams of the forensic team's lights, the shallow grave gave up its secret. A skeleton curled inward on itself, like a dying question hands clutching empty air. Jack Monroe stood back from the scene, arms folded tight against the chill sinking into his jacket. It wasn't Emily Carter. It wasn't even close. The bones were too old. The clothes, scraps of a faded floral dress, had rotted into dust and memory, and the skull, when gently lifted, revealed hair, still clinging in brittle strands, dark brown, not blonde. 5 years gone, maybe more. Buried under the old chapel, forgotten but not forgiven. Rook sat beside Jack, silent ears pinned back against his head. The lead forensic tech, a woman named Harper, approached, pulling down her mask. Female. She said, voice stripped of anything but professionalism. Early 20s. Estimated time of death, 5 to 7 years. Jack's mouth was dry. Harper glanced back at the remains. Fractured skull. Blunt force trauma, probably died quickly. Probably. Jack nodded, once the motion mechanical. He didn't ask if they'd find dental records. He already knew the answer. Somewhere, a family was still waiting for a daughter who would never come home. Another prayer, swallowed by Hollow Abbey. Father Michael's hands were too steady when Jack confronted him. That was the first sign. They sat opposite each other in the Abbey's empty refectory. the long oak tables stretching out like abandoned pews. The rain battered the high windows, blurring the world into gray smears. Jack laid the photo on the table between them. A reconstruction of the remains, an age-progressed guess at what the girl might have looked like before someone decided she didn't matter anymore. Father Michael didn't even blink. "I don't recognize her," he said. His voice was even almost bored. Jack said nothing, only watched. The silence grew teeth. Finally, Father Michael shifted, lacing his fingers together over the tabletop. "Detective, we've had hundreds of visitors over the years. Lost souls, runaways, people who come here seeking something we can't always give. Perhaps she didn't leave." Jack said quietly, "She was buried." Father Michael exhaled slowly, like a man trying not to snap a delicate thread. "And you believe we had something to do with that?" "I believe someone here did." A flicker, then a tightening at the corner of Father Michael's mouth. "Not fear, contempt." Jack leaned in, lowering his voice until it was barely a breath. "Emily Carter scratched 'Please help me' into a stone wall with her fingernails before she died." Father Michael finally looked away. Jack saw it, the crack running through the center of him, small but spreading fast. Good. He stood, collecting the photo with slow, deliberate care. "We're searching everything," Jack said. "Records, donations, guest logs. Whatever you're hiding, it's bleeding through the walls." Father Michael didn't respond, but the tremor in his knuckles betrayed him. Rook growled once low and certain. Outside, the bells began to toll again, a hollow sound shuddering through the bones of the abbey like a warning. The records room was hidden behind a false panel in the sacristy, a place Jack wouldn't have found without Brother Thomas's stammering, half-choked directions. The door creaked open on a gust of cold, dry air, thick with the smell of mildew and secrets. Shelves sagged under the weight of old ledgers and ledger books, paperwork dating back decades, donations logged by hand in neat, slanted script, names scratched out, amounts circled and corrected. Jack moved methodically, Rook padding at his side. The books were dirty, but not abandoned. Someone had been here recently. Some volumes were stacked, oddly shifted to hide the gaps where other books had been pulled and not replaced. Evidence moved. Evidence hidden. Jack scanned quickly, trained instinct guiding his hands. Guest registries. First, rows and rows of names, signatures trailing like lost ghosts across the pages. He found Emily Carter's name easily dated 2 months ago. Underneath another name caught his eye, Anna Whitmore. 5 years back. Jack flipped to the next page and frowned. No signature, no checkout date. Just a name written in someone else's hand. Darker ink. Different pressure. Anna Whitmore had entered Hollow Abbey, but according to the books she had never left. He ran a thumb along the edge of the paper, feeling the indentation of erased lines. Jack tucked the book under his arm and turned back toward the hall. Behind him, the records whispered against each other in the draft 1,000 prayers, 1,000 lies. And somewhere in the distance a door slammed shut. Back in the main hall, the monks gathered in tight clusters, whispering urgently. The storm had snapped the power. The chandeliers hung lifeless, the candlelight jittering across the stone walls, casting huge, shaking shadows. Fear was a living thing now. It moved through Hollow Abbey with a limp and a hunger. Jack moved among them, like a ghost, searching faces, searching eyes. Father Michael was nowhere to be seen. Rook circled tense, nose twitching. Jack tapped his radio. "Control. This is Monroe. Lock down all exits. Nobody leaves until I say so." A burst of static. "Confirmed." Jack moved faster now. Rook leading. He knew how this game played out. The righteous never stayed to face judgment. They ran and they bled. He found the priest in the crypt beneath the main chapel. The iron gates hung open, the stale air carrying the smell of cold stone and candle wax. Father Michael stood at the far end, back to the entrance facing the cracked statue of the Virgin. His robes pooled around his feet like spilled oil. A single candle burned at the base of the statue, throwing just enough light to carve the outlines of his profile in golden shadow. He was praying, whispering so low Jack could barely catch the words. Not pleas for forgiveness, not repentance, just a steady, fevered litany. As if he said it enough times it would become true. Jack stepped forward, boots scraping the stone. Father Michael didn't turn. "I tried," he said. His voice cracked in the middle, a jagged, splintered thing. "I tried to save them." Jack didn't answer. Words were too small for this place. He moved closer, feeling the cold creep up from the floor through the soles of his boots. "I didn't kill her," Father Michael said. "I didn't kill any of them." Jack stopped a few feet away, the candlelight guttering between them. "But you knew." Jack said it wasn't a question. Father Michael lowered his head. The candle trembled. Jack stared at him. This man who had built a kingdom of silence, who had buried girls under prayers, and told himself it was mercy. "You let it happen," Jack said softer now, deadly, "and then you locked the doors and lit the candles and sang the hymns." Jack continued, voice like a blade sliding slow between ribs, "And you thought the darkness would forget." Father Michael finally looked up. His face was hollow, not just from guilt, from rot. It had eaten him alive from the inside out. Jack stepped back. "Turn around," he said. Father Michael hesitated, then slowly, mechanically turned, wrists limp at his sides. Jack cuffed him. The click of metal, sharp and final in the stillness. Outside the crypt, the rain hammered harder against the roof. Jack led him up the narrow stone stairs, past the weeping monks, past the burning candles, past the shattered illusion of peace. Hollow Abbey moaned under the weight of it. The blood, the silence, the bones that would not stay buried. And somewhere deep under all of it, Jack knew there were still more secrets clawing for air. Rook trotted at his side, silent and watchful. The storm swallowed them whole as they crossed the threshold into a night where the dead had started to speak. The first thing Jack noticed was the ink, thick, almost angry against the yellowed pages. It wasn't prayer requests, it wasn't donation receipts, it was blood translated into numbers. The hidden ledger sat at the bottom of a locked cabinet behind the sacristy altar. The lock had been snapped open with a crowbar, the metal teeth still twisted and gaping. Jack turned the pages slowly. Rook sitting rigidly at his side, nose twitching in the dust-heavy air. Every line item was a confession. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. Anonymous donations, pilgrim stipends, retreat maintenance fees. Money moving in and out like a tide of rot. And then in the margins, notes in Father Michael's cramped, spidery hand, Brother Eli 15K silence regarding incident Miaune 3K Inadide. Brother Thomas 5K cooperation secured. Security for chapel basement talk. Jack's stomach went cold. They had paid for silence, paid for loyalty, paid for graves. His fingers tightened around the ledger until the leather creaked, behind the language of faith and devotion. Hollow Abbey had been running a business of shadows where prayers were currency and the dead were collateral damage. The last few pages were blank, but the stain had already spread too far to be erased. Rook barked, once sharp urgent. Jack jerked his head up, heart hammering. The dog was pawing at the back of the cabinet, ears flattened, tail rigid. Jack crouched low, running his fingers along the wood. A faint seam, a hidden panel. He pressed hard. The panel popped free with a soft crack, revealing a shallow cavity between the walls. Inside, wrapped in a dirty scrap of canvas, was a small black cell phone, the cheap kind you could buy anonymously at a gas station burner phone. Jack wiped it clean with a gloved hand, his breath fogging in the cold. The battery was almost dead. 1%, one voice memo, no title, no timestamp. Jack glanced at Rook, who sat tense and expectant, eyes locked on the phone, like it was a live grenade. Jack plugged in his earbuds, thumb trembling slightly, and pressed play. The recording hissed for a second, white noise broken by a girl's ragged breathing. Then a whisper rushed and panicked. "This is Emily Carter. If you're hearing this, something happened to me. I know what they're doing. It's not just the money, it's not just the lies. Please, if you find this—" A crash in the background. A shout. Emily gasped, voice breaking into a sob. "He knows he's coming." The recording cut out with a sharp burst of static. Silence. Jack sat frozen for a long moment, the echo of her voice still filling his ears, seeping under his skin. Emily hadn't just been a victim of chance. She had known. She had confronted them, and they had silenced her. Not because she stumbled into something, because she fought it, because she refused to pray harder and shut her eyes like the others. Jack pocketed the phone carefully, his hands bloodless and shaking. There would be no forgiveness for what Hollow Abbey had done. Not now. Not ever. The main chapel looked different now. Not just because of the storm damage, the broken windows, the cracked marble. It looked hollow dead. A corpse in a cathedral skin. Jack stood before the altar, staring up at the cracked crucifix hanging above. The Abbey's business model had been simple. Recruit vulnerable pilgrims, extract money through guilt, fear, and manipulation, silence anyone who asked too many questions. And when silence wasn't enough, well, Jack knew where the bodies were. He had walked over them. He had smelled the blood that the rain hadn't been able to wash away. The monks were being processed one by one. Now, handcuffed, photographed their heads, bowed not in prayer but in shame. Jack watched them through the rain-streaked glass doors, a grim procession of cowards. Father Michael sat in an interrogation room, saying nothing. Rook sat beside Jack, head resting on his boots. Waiting like him, because the real question still hung heavy between them. Who else knew? Who else helped? Who else walked through the halls of Hollow Abbey, heard the cries from beneath the floorboards, and said nothing? The ledger had names, but Jack knew the truth was bigger than ink on paper. The truth was built into the walls, into the prayers, into the silence that had swallowed Emily Carter and Anna Whitmore. And how many others? He moved forward, one slow step at a time, feeling the weight of the Abbey pressing down on him. No forgiveness here, only reckoning. Later that night, Jack sat in his car, the rain hammering the windshield in frantic, uneven bursts. He held Emily's burner phone in his hand, turning it over slowly. The battery had finally died. No signal in these woods anyway. He thumbed the cracked plastic back into place and dropped it into an evidence bag. It didn't feel like enough. It never did. Outside, the Abbey loomed black against the broken sky, a silhouette of every bad thing humans could build when they decided prayers were more important than truth. Jack closed his eyes. He could still hear her voice. Not the panic, not the fear, the defiance, the refusal to kneel. A girl who knew the monsters wore robes and smiles. A girl who didn't run fast enough. Rook let out a soft whine from the passenger seat, shifting closer, resting his head against Jack's thigh. Jack opened his eyes, staring into the storm. Tomorrow they would start digging again. Tomorrow they would rip out the floorboards. Tomorrow they would tear down every secret, every lie, every wall. But tonight all he could do was sit in the dark, listening to the rain and remember her name, Emily Carter. She didn't die for nothing. Not if Jack had anything to say about it. Some betrayals don't come with knives. They come with silence, folded hands, and prayers whispered too late. Brother Thomas sat slumped in the interrogation room, his robe soaked through, clinging to him like a second sodden skin. His mouth trembled, but no sound came out. Jack Monroe watched him from the other side of the glass, arms crossed, feeling every second of the storm, clawing at the Abbey's shattered windows. It wasn't over. Not even close. He pushed open the door, the smell of wet earth and cold sweat bleeding into the room. Thomas flinched. Jack sat across from him, slow, deliberate. "Start talking." Jack said. Thomas squeezed his hands together until the knuckles went bloodless. For a moment it seemed he might say nothing, that the silence would win again. But then his voice cracked through the heavy air, small and broken. It wasn't just Father Michael. Jack stayed still. He didn't plan it. Thomas whispered. He covered it. Lied for them, lied for us. But it was Brother Elias who decided what happened when people found out too much. Jack's chest went cold. "Elias," Jack said carefully. "He's still here." Thomas shook his head violently. "He heard about the search, about you finding everything he's running." Jack was on his feet before the last word left the boy's mouth. The woods behind Hollow Abbey swallowed sound like a grave. The rain came down in sheets, the mist curling low over the ground. Pines bent and groaned under the weight of it, branches clawing at the darkness. Jack sprinted, boots punching holes into the mud, breath tearing through his lungs. Rook ran ahead, a streak of tense muscle and motion, nose locked on the fleeing scent. The radio crackled in Jack's ear, disjointed voices, fractured orders. None of it mattered, only the trail, only the man who had chosen death over confession. The flashlight beam jerked wildly with every step, carving glimpses of broken ground, of snapped branches, of a flash of movement, a figure lurching through the trees ahead, robes sodden and black. Brother Elias, the second Judas. Jack pushed harder. Branches whipped his face, clawed at his jacket. Mud sucked at his boots. His legs screamed, but he kept moving, kept his body a thin thread of will through the storm. Ahead, Elias stumbled, half fell, caught himself against a tree. Rook barked a short savage sound and lunged. The monk screamed as Rook clamped onto his robe, dragging him down into the mud. Jack was there an instant later, wrenching Elias up by the collar, slamming him against the trunk of a dead pine. Elias panted, wide-eyed rain coursing down his face, mixing with the blood from a split lip. Jack leaned in, breathless. "You want to run?" Jack hissed. "You want to hide?" Elias whimpered. Jack shoved him harder against the tree. "How many?" Jack demanded. "How many are buried out here?" Elias's mouth opened, closed, opened again, and then he broke. "There's a map," he gasped. "A map in the vestry safe. It shows where." Jack stared at him, feeling the rage pulse under his skin like a second heart. A map, like it was normal. Routine, a ledger of graves. He yanked Elias forward, hands tight around his wrists, cuffing him roughly. "You're going to show me," Jack said, voice low and lethal. "No tricks, no prayers." Elias whimpered again, but he nodded. Behind them, Hollow Abbey loomed a crumbling monument to rot. The dead were waiting, and Jack would find every last one of them. The safe in the vestry was hidden behind a loose panel under the confessional booth. Jack pried it open with a crowbar, Elias flinching with every shriek of splintering wood. Inside, yellowed papers, sealed envelopes, wads of cash wrapped in twine. And the map. Jack unfolded it slowly. Hand-drawn, faded, but unmistakable. The grounds of Hollow Abbey sketched in rough lines, tiny X's scattered across it like pockmarks, each one labeled with a date. A name. Anna Whitmore. 2017. Elise Grant, 2014. Marion Douglas, 2016. Emily Carter's name was scrawled in shaky ink, barely legible. Jack's vision blurred for a moment. Not from the rain, not from exhaustion, from fury. He dropped the map into an evidence bag with shaking hands. "This ends tonight," he said to Elias. The monk sat crumpled on the floor, hands cuffed, mouth slack. Jack wasn't sure he even understood. Maybe he never had. Maybe he had buried those girls with the same numb, mechanical faith he used to recite prayers. But it didn't matter now. The dead didn't care why you forgot them. Only that you did. Outside, the rain had finally begun to slacken, mist rising from the sodden earth in thick, curling tendrils. Jack led Elias across the courtyard, the map tucked inside his jacket. Rook flanking them with ears pinned back. Other officers waited at the gates, flashlights sweeping the ruins, radios crackling with updates. The Abbey looked smaller now, shrunken, like a mouth that had eaten too much and begun to rot from the inside out. Jack glanced up at the crucifix above the main chapel door, cracked, half-fallen. A prayer, half-swallowed, a promise half-kept. He tightened his grip on Elias's cuffs. This place would answer for what it had done, even if it had to answer in bones and dirt and silence. Especially then. The search teams moved fast once the map was in their hands. Cadaver dogs, Rook among them, spread through the grounds, noses pressed to the wet earth. Tails stiff. Markers went up. Flags fluttered weakly in the mist. Each flag a body. Each flag a girl. Each flag a broken promise. Jack stood at the edge of the clearing, the mud sucking at his boots, the rain beating on his jacket. He watched the markers multiply, red, yellow, white. The colors blurred together until they didn't look like flags anymore. They looked like gravestones. Rook whined, softly pressing against Jack's leg. Jack didn't move, didn't blink, didn't look away. This was what justice looked like. Not clean, not neat. Not wrapped up in courtrooms and verdicts. It was messy, ugly, real. It was digging through the mud with your bare hands and dragging the truth out one broken bone at a time. It was standing in the rain, soaked and shaking, while the ghosts whispered your name. It was not forgetting, never forgetting, no matter how much it cost. Jack closed his eyes. Behind them, in the chapel's broken shadow, the Abbey bells tolled one final time. Heavy, hollow wrong. The dead didn't need bells. They needed someone who would not let their names be erased. And Jack Monroe swore, standing in that shattered courtyard, that Hollow Abbey would never be silent again. Some places burn easier than others. Maybe because they were hollow long before the fire. Jack Monroe stood at the edge of Hollow Abbey, the smoke rising in thick black ropes against the battered sky. Flames licked through the broken windows, devouring pews, altars, confessionals. Every lie the walls had ever swallowed. It wasn't justice, but it was something. Behind him, Rook lay still on a stretcher, an oxygen mask strapped awkwardly over his muzzle. His chest rising and falling in shallow, stubborn gasps. Jack's hands shook as he lit a cigarette. He wouldn't smoke. The fire cracked and roared, angry and wild, eating everything that had refused to confess. Jack turned and walked into it one last time. The catacombs beneath Hollow Abbey were a maze of damp stone and rotting wood, half-forgotten tunnels carved out generations ago by men who believed hiding things could make them holy. The smoke slithered through the cracks, heavy and slow, like something alive. Jack moved fast, Rook limping beside him. Despite the vet's frantic protests, they had come this far together. They would end it together. The deeper they went, the heavier the air became, thick with wet ash, and something fouler, the sour metallic stink of death that no fire could mask. Jack's flashlight flickered. the beam stuttering over ancient stone walls marked with soot and moss, and then at the far end of a collapsed corridor half buried under shattered beams, a flash of fabric. Blue. Emily's jacket. Jack's heart seized. He dropped to his knees, hacking through the debris with bloody hands, splinters digging deep into his palms. The jacket came free, first, then the arm, delicate. Still wrapped in a friendship bracelet, frayed nearly to dust. Emily Carter. Jack didn't need dental records or DNA. He knew. He sat back on his heels, choking on smoke, eyes burning in more ways than one. Rook whined low in his throat and pressed against Jack's side. It should have ended there. But the Abbey still had one more cruelty left. Jack heard the click a second before the floor shuddered. A trap, old wires, pressure plates rigged decades ago maybe to collapse tunnels to erase secrets when the time came. The stone above them groaned. Jack lunged. He shoved Rook ahead, the dog scrambling toward the only shaft of light. A ladder bolted into the far wall. The ceiling gave way behind them, stone and timber raining down in a deafening roar. Jack didn't feel the impact, not at first. Only the sickening snap as something tore in his shoulder when he grabbed the rung and hauled himself upward. Rook climbing ahead with frantic, staggering steps. They broke into the open air like drowning men breaking the surface of a black ocean. Smoke rain, sirens. Jack collapsed onto the mud, dragging Rook into his arms. The Abbey shuddered one last time behind them. A low, grinding death rattle before the roof caved in, sending a geyser of sparks into the night sky. Hollow Abbey at last was dying. Hours later, when the fire had burned itself down to steaming piles of charred wood and molten stone, Jack stood at the gravesite. Not the old cemetery behind the Abbey, that place had been poisoned by too many false prayers. No, this was a clearing beyond the woods where the mist hung low over the grass, and the trees stood silent like sentries. Emily Carter's final resting place. The brass plaque glinted under the thin, watery sunlight. Emily Carter, 1999-2024. She spoke. They tried to silence her. They failed. Jack knelt, laying a single white flower at the base of the stone. Rook sat beside him, wrapped in bandages, one ear still charred at the edges. They stayed that way a long time, two battered survivors, the last witnesses to a place that had prayed louder for forgiveness than it ever did for truth. Jack reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the friendship bracelet he had found in the rubble, faded, frayed, but still whole. He laid it gently across the top of the grave. A promise, not forgotten. Never forgotten. The wind picked up, threading through the clearing, carrying away the last ashes of Hollow Abbey into the endless gray sky. Jack rose slowly, joints aching, heart heavier than it had ever been. He turned toward the woods. Rook limped at his side. They didn't look back. There was nothing left behind them that deserved to be remembered, only the girl, only her name. And maybe, just maybe, the fire had carried her voice farther than the walls ever could. Maybe this time someone would listen. Maybe this time the silence would finally break.